Hi, everybody. Welcome to Global Encounters and First Nations Peoples seminar series for 2026. Can you believe it? 2026. Doesn't time fly? I'm Lynette Russell, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of Naarm, or as we call it today, Melbourne. And we pay respect to the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, Bunurong, and other members of the Kulin Nation. And we acknowledge that the support that we've had in running the work that we've been doing over the last few years. I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce to you Dr. Rohan Howitt, such a famous name, Howitt, in this part of the world. Rohan is a lecturer in environmental history at Monash, and he's a global and environmental historian of the Southern Ocean world. His research examines the deep interconnected histories of Australia, Antarctica, and New Zealand, and the sub-Antarctic islands of the Southern Ocean itself. The focus of this is what he's written his first book on, The Southern Frontier, Australia, Antarctica and Empire in the Southern Ocean World, which Melbourne University Press published last year. To much acclaim, I might add, too. I'm delighted he's also going to be talking about his ongoing project on exploring the history of Phantom Islands, which sounds absolutely fascinating, doesn't it? And his other research includes Australian migration histories, animal histories, and the history of chartered companies. Rohan, that just comes completely out from left wing, that one. Uh,
Yes.
Prior to joining Monash, Rohan was the inaugural postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Environmental History at the ANU in 2022. He completed his PhD at the University of Sydney, and he's lectured in history and global studies at the University of Sydney and the University of Wollongong. It's an absolute delight to have him speaking in our first seminar for the year. And I'm going to hand over to you now because I didn't tell you what he was going to talk about, though, did I? An Antarctic iceberg and world history in the 1850s, as you can see right there. Okay, I will disappear and hand over to Rohan.
Thanks so much, Lynette. So, a little after sunset on the evening of 22nd of March, 1855, the newly constructed passenger ship Ralph Waller, which is not the ship in this photo because it doesn't exist, but it's kind of like this one. So, this ship was making good speed on its voyage from Liverpool to Melbourne. Borne by strong westerly winds, the ship was gliding along at 10 knots, about 18.5 kilometers an hour. The Ralph Waller was on track to complete its first Anglo-Australian voyage to Port Phillip Bay in about 80 days. Not quite enough to threaten the record that stood at 74 days, but fast, even by the standards of the 1850s. The ship was passing through one of the most remote stretches of ocean in the world. The nearest land that night was Albany in Western Australia, 1,750 kilometres to the northeast. Wilkes Land in Antarctica was 1,900 kilometres to the south, and the uninhabited subantarctic Kerguelen Islands were 2,500 kilometres to the west. The sleet and snow that had been falling for much of the last week had eased, but temperatures were still hovering around 0 degrees Celsius. Most of the ship's 180 passengers were below decks, riding, talking, or playing games by the light of oil lamps. Those on board the Ralph Waller had been fortunate thus far to avoid the worst elements that characterised the long voyage from England to Australia. Only 3 people had been ill so far, and all of them had recovered, which was a far cry from some of the horror stories. A couple of years earlier, a ship had had an 11.6% mortality rate, and there were these kind of unsettling stories that always circulated amongst migrants. So the passengers had been grumbling about dropping so far south, to the point that the captain had decided to just stop disclosing the ship's latitude to them, so they didn't know how far south they went. And several of them were complaining of chilblains on their hands and feet. But for the most part, this had been a safe, comfortable voyage on a route that was infamous for being anything but. Then, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, the Ralph Waller smashed head-on into an iceberg. In pure energy terms, the force of the collision would be roughly comparable to 25 cars colliding with each other simultaneously at 100 kilometers an hour. The impact lasted about 10 seconds and cleft the iceberg in two. One passenger, James Butters, described feeling as if he'd been knocked back 2 feet out of the water. Throughout the ship, people were thrown to the floor as the oak timbers crumbled. The first 6 meters of the ship's stem was destroyed, ripping open the bow below the waterline. Icy water began to slowly flood into the ship, and within 15 minutes, the water level in the hold had risen to 4.5 meters. The entire ship's complement, around 180 passengers and 30 crew, gathered on the cramped decks. The scene on the quarterdeck at this time, James Butters wrote in his diary, was really awful. Men, women, and children all crowded to it with their blankets wrapped around them, and their cries for mercy were pitiful. The boats were got ready and over the side of the ship. So the Ralph Waller was clearly in a perilous situation. While it would, in theory, have been possible to cram all 210 people on board into the 4 boats that it was obliged to carry, there was no likelihood of 4 boats being found by other passing ships before they succumbed to exposure or the boats were swamped in what were the roughest seas in the world. And as the passengers heard reports from the crew or looked below themselves, they recognized that the ship was foundering and that there was essentially no hope of rescue. So to buy some time, the Ralph Waller's captain, Daniel Lewis, ordered some of his crew to drop a sail over the bow to slow the flood of water, which is an old technique known as fothering, while the rest of the crew set up and manned the ship's pumps. This strategy ultimately worked far better than anyone expected. Over the next few hours, the manual chain pumps were kept in constant operation, removing something like a ton of water every minute. The male passengers were rallied and pressed into service to keep the pumps going and to bail buckets of water overboard throughout the night. 200 tons of cargo and post was also jettisoned to lighten the vessel. And these measures bought enough time for the ship's carpenter to jury-rig a patch for the main part of the hole in the bow. By sunrise on the morning of 23rd of March, the carpenter's patch had held, and the ship had sunk no further than it had half an hour after striking the iceberg. The ship's 90 male passengers were organised into work gangs, and for the next 6 days they were set to work operating the pumps around the clock. The ship was still essentially disabled, and it almost sank on 2 further occasions. The first when the wind picked up and ripped apart the sail that had been plugging the hole, then again when it was caught in a storm and the passengers had to tie themselves to the pumps to keep them going. But the Ralph Waller survived, and slowly the broken ship made its way towards land. It reached the entrance to Port Phillip Bay on 6th of April and was towed by a local steamer into Melbourne the following day. This story of the Ralph Waller and its dramatic encounter with an Antarctic iceberg is not especially well known, unless you've spoken to me about it in the last 10 years, in which case I've probably subjected you to a lengthy discussion of it because I am a little bit obsessed. I think the thing is that striking an iceberg and being press ganged into service operating pumps for 2 weeks was so far outside of the ordinary experience of passenger voyages to Australia that it doesn't really warrant a mention in the literature on life at sea on the Anglo-Australian route in this period. But at the same time, despite the dramatic kind of story arc, everything essentially turned out fine. One passenger did die soon after arriving in Australia, which his family blamed on exposure during his time at the pumps, but there were no other documented casualties. The ship was even made seaworthy again. The episode was extraordinary, but not extraordinary enough to sustain historical interest in its own right, in the manner of something like the 1909 disappearance of the Waratah, which is popularly known as Australia's Titanic. In this paper, I want to experiment with thinking about this particular episode in Australia's history in a bit of a different way. I argue that the brief encounter between this ship and this iceberg, which occupied the same space in the Southern Ocean for all of 10 seconds in 1855, should be considered an instance of, to borrow Eduardo Grandi's term, the exceptional normal. In the classical tradition of microhistory, the key side of analysis is where an exceptional event and historical structures collide, making those wider social and cultural structures visible and comprehensible in a way that would not be possible at other scales of inquiry. In the more recent tradition of global microhistory, Global historians have applied a similar method of deep archival investigation of outlying cases to create narratively rich analyses that render global processes of connection, exchange, and integration legible. The case of the Ralph Waller does fit into that framework. I think it does yield some useful critical insights into the structures of global connectivity that transformed Australia in the 1850s, and it's something I will touch on a little. But my idea in this paper, and with the larger project that this serves as a pilot for, is that we can push this method further to produce a kind of planetary microhistory. That is, this collision between ice and wood on a cold evening in March 1855 was also, I think, a moment of collision between global and planetary forces. And by planetary forces, I mean the fundamental environmental processes of our planet: carbon, water, biogeochemical, and energy cycling, and the movement of the Earth's crust, the species that comprise its biosphere, and its atmospheric and ocean currents. There have been growing calls for environmental historians to engage in self-consciously planetary histories that analyze and narrate the interaction between humans and these kinds of environmental processes. But unsurprisingly, given the scope and nature of this research, it's really proven quite difficult to do. And so at one end, you have these huge whole Earth histories, works like John McNeill and Peter Engelke's The Great Acceleration, McNeill's Something New Under the Sun, kind of these books that provide terrific insights into how human societies have disrupted and dysregulated planetary processes, but which to do so have had to kind of abandon the human scale of historical writing. And at the other end, you have these incredibly rich histories of the human societies that have pushed Earth systems beyond their limits, work like Andreas Malm's account of the origins of the fossil economy. But this kind of Anthropocene history ends up being a little one-sided, I think, in its engagement with these planetary processes. It tells of human impacts on planetary processes, but it doesn't really shed light on this idea of interactions. And so my argument is that we can push the methods of microhistory and global microhistory that little bit further by recognizing that global processes have always played out on a planet that is, as Sujit Sivasundaram evocatively puts it, fissured, crusted, summited, atmospheric, and terraqueous. By investigating and narrating the collision between an unusual event and planetary processes, we can, I think, make the interaction of the human, the global, and the planetary visible and comprehensible in a fashion that is impossible at other scales, allowing us to recognize the historical agency of the Earth without confining ourselves to narratives of the whole Earth. So that's a bit of background, and I've also already kind of gone through the 10-second encounter between the Ralph Waller and an iceberg as best as I can reconstruct it. For the rest of this paper, I want to address essentially two interrelated questions about this encounter, which is essentially one, what brought the ship there, and two, what brought the iceberg there? What are the journeys that these two actors were involved in? And by addressing those questions, my aim is to reflect a little on what these journeys reveal about the interaction of the planetary and the global in Australia's and world history. And so I'll start with talking a little bit about the context of the Ralph Waller's passage to Melbourne. And this is just a photo from a later collision from 1899 showing another ship that ran head-on into an iceberg. There's no images of the Ralph Waller, but this gives a bit of a sense of what a collision like that looks like. This was a much more minor one, but it's the best I can do to bring it to scale. So the first point I want to make is that colliding with an iceberg and surviving for it to become a story in the media and a staple of family lore for generations was quite unusual. I'm aware of 7 such iceberg collisions on the Anglo-Australian route between 1789, which is the famous one of The Guardian, and 1922. But the experience of simply encountering icebergs during voyages to and from Australia was very common. And that's something that I think has been overlooked a little bit too readily in Australian historiography. Because when we think about ships running into icebergs, the Titanic casts a very long and I think quite distorting shadow. And because of the kind of profound cultural resonance of the Titanic, iceberg strikes are associated with the North Atlantic far more so than they are with the Southern Hemisphere. I do hope to eventually crunch the numbers enough to properly quantify this. Um, but for this paper, I think it is sufficient to say that icebergs weren't maybe quite as common a sight on the Anglo-Australian route as they were on the better known North Atlantic run, but it's actually pretty tight, pretty comparable in terms of raw numbers. And it goes through particular seasons, which 1855 is one of, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So if it was pretty common to encounter icebergs, it does raise the obvious question of, well, why were ships like the Ralph Waller routinely sailing amongst icebergs? The answer to that is that by the 1850s, there were two dominant sailing routes connecting Australia and New Zealand to Europe and North America. The first of these is the one that you can see plotted on this image, which is the Admiralty route. This was the route recommended by the pilot books published by the British Hydrographic Office. These were books of charts and sailing directions that were an essential part of any ship's sort of equipment. They were one of the real kind of fundamental technologies of 19th century globalization. And the Admiralty sailing directions recommended that the masters of ships sailing to Australia head south from the Cape of Good Hope down to no further than 39 degrees, which, to put it in context, is roughly the latitude of Wilson's Promontory. So that's the kind of the turning point when you've gone far enough south and you start heading east towards Australia. The idea is you then kind of proceed along that parallel until you reach their chosen port. And so you can see this route, these kind of colored lines are all different established routes for doing that within the Admiralty guidelines. Now, this was an extremely safe route. It allowed ships to harness the prevailing westerly winds of the high 30s without exposing them to the unpredictable, tempestuous conditions of the roaring 40s. It avoided all but the most exceptional icebergs, and it also significantly avoided all of the sub-Antarctic islands that were very easy to run directly into in darkness or bad weather. And that's a whole other paper I could do about running into islands instead of icebergs. But this safety, it came at the cost of speed. Dropping farther south before pushing east towards Australia and New Zealand would cut huge distances off the route. So following the 40th parallel south instead of the 38th would mean covering 380 nautical miles fewer, which would shave at least 2 days off a voyage. A course along the 45th parallel would save another 650 nautical miles, which is over 1,200 kilometers, compared to a course along the 40th. A course along the 50th would save another 480 nautical miles over the 45th, and so on. You have to get down into the 60s and basically be going along the Antarctic coastline to max out those benefits. And it was this time saving that made an alternate route so tempting. In Liverpool, a navigation expert called John Towson famously began advising local mariners when they came to do their exams with him to adopt a more southerly route from about 1848. And he started producing his own navigation tables to help them do so. So kind of a bootleg offshoot to the official Admiralty instructions. And so mariners began experimenting with more southerly routes, and in doing so, they produced more data about the amount of time that could be saved by ignoring the Admiralty direction. So this red dot that I've just plonked on the map is where the Ralph Waller struck its iceberg. So you can see a sense of how much further down. I've got a map later on that will show kind of that it was on its way northeast at this point, so you can see how much further south it's dropped than the Admiralty. Over in the United States, Matthew Fontaine Maury was an officer in the US Navy when his active duty career was ended by injury in 1839. He was then posted to a desk job at the Navy's Depot of Charts and Instruments, where he became obsessed with improving navigation by amassing and analyzing data about winds, ocean currents, and Great Circle navigation routes. And so in 1850, Maury published the first edition of his own book, which was called Notice to Mariners, which recommended that mariners on a voyage to Australia should drop down to at least 45 degrees south, then use their judgment to take as southerly a route as possible whilst still being safe to do so. And when you factor in both the greatly shortened distance to travel and the much more intense westerly winds and ocean currents that are characteristic of the Roaring Forties, following Maury's route could easily cut 30 to 40 days off the voyage compared to the more conservative Admiralty route. And with such massive time savings available, ever more mariners were drawn to the more southerly Towson or Maury route. And so by the time of the Ralph Waller's encounter with an iceberg in 1855, this route had become quite routine. New ships like the Ralph Waller had been built with features designed to take advantage of this route. They had longer, narrower frames, sharper, more tapered bows, much larger sail areas, reinforced hulls sheathed in a copper zinc alloy to reduce drag, all sorts of things to make the ships better suited to sailing in those latitudes. The downside, of course, to this more southerly route was that it overlapped with the northern limits of Antarctic iceberg distribution. So Antarctic icebergs are normally found south of 50 degrees. And again, for kind of a little bit of regional geographical context, that would be 330 kilometres south of Rakiura Stewart Island in New Zealand, if that puts it into context a bit. That's the kind of normal northern line of Antarctic icebergs. But it's not actually unusual to find them between 45 and 50. So for example, twice in the last century, icebergs have been visible from the coastal suburbs of Dunedin, which is at 45 degrees south in 1931 and 2006. And probably the best known iceberg encounter in Australia's history was the case of the Guardian in 1789, when the Guardian's captain, Edward Rieu, attempted to harvest ice for fresh water when he spotted an iceberg at 44 degrees south, 12 days after leaving Cape Town with a cargo of supplies for the British colony in New South Wales. When fog rolled in, Rieu lost sight of the iceberg and collided with an underwater foot of it. The Guardian began to sink, and while 259 people left on boats, of which only 15 survived, Rieu determined to stay with the ship. He and 61 others then sailed essentially crippled and flooded ship back to South Africa, where it was driven ashore and wrecked. Other icebergs have been encountered as far north as 42 degrees in the 1890s, which, again, for context, that's the parallel of latitude that runs directly through the Tasmanian town of Ross, if anyone's spent any time in Tasmania. The most northerly iceberg sighting I'm aware of in this sector of Antarctica was at 35.5 degrees south, which is in the Great Australian Bight in 1928. So by the 1850s, most of the ships on the Anglo-Australian route were heading into the 40s, making iceberg sightings increasingly commonplace. And any mariner that had serious designs on competing for the fastest passage, and a lot of them were, they were dropping well into the 50s. And that's exactly what the Ralph Waller had done. So on that morning of 2nd of March, on the morning of 2nd of March, 1855, and you can see I've just plotted this here, the passengers had awoken to find the deck covered in snow, and that afternoon they saw their first iceberg, which was a large, flat-topped tabular iceberg, 27 meters high and 1.7 kilometers long at 46 degrees 5 minutes south. So that's the furthest left pin on this map. They spotted two more later that evening, one of which was estimated to be 4 to 5 kilometers long and over 60 meters high. And then the following morning, they found themselves surrounded by an ice field of much smaller icebergs. And James Butters's diary that I was referring to earlier hints at the anxiety that this experience caused. He wrote on 3rd of March that we all wish to get out of this and hope that the captain will consider that he is far enough south and steer away to the east. But after clearing that broken ice field, Captain Lewis continued on a southeasterly course, passing more icebergs along the way. So you can see this second pin from the left is the furthest south point that he took them to, which is at 53 degrees. when they're still seeing icebergs all along that way, and the passengers are complaining that they cannot see them at all in the dark. They just appear beside them. So taking a lot of risks. They finally commenced their northeasterly course on the 11th of March, past the Kerguelen Islands, which is this yellow pin here, on the 5th of March, 15th of March, and they were kind of looking forward to better weather. They hadn't seen icebergs in a couple of days. But then on the 21st of March, this pin here, they again, as they crossed the 49th parallel, encountered icebergs, and then the collision took place the following night. So again, I have to emphasize there was nothing unusual about this route or about sailing amongst ice in this way. A faster passage meant less lost wages, less opportunity cost, often a newer, more comfortable ship, so there was real demand amongst passengers to sail on these routes. For shipping companies, it made the route more profitable, and if they broke or at least competed for records, it would bring huge publicity to the ships, the captains, the company they represented. So there was real demand on both sides to try this. The Ralph Waller then was in very good company, and in the same year, a ship called the George Marshall had encountered dense pack ice at only 41 degrees and been trapped by it for 300 miles. At least 6 other ships reported close encounters and near misses between 42 and 47 degrees south in the period from February to April 1855. And another ship called the Guiding Star left Liverpool a few days after the Ralph Waller in January 1855 with 481 assisted migrants and a crew of 62 on board. The Guiding Star was last seen in the South Atlantic, and given its captain had broken the record for the fastest Liverpool to Wellington passage by going down to 54 degrees south, we can assume it followed a similar course and most likely encountered ice. With no word of the ship by September 1855, it was presumed to have hit an iceberg and sunk. It's quite difficult to quantify the effect of the loss of 543 people in a single incident, but a small note in the Argus gives some insight. So in September 1855, the paper reported that a female correspondent had been anxiously expecting her mother, 4 brothers, and 2 sisters to arrive on the Guiding Star and asked the Argus for information on the ship, complaining that she could not get an answer from the ship's agents. The paper noted that there was simply no news to share. So it's pretty well established that the 1850s was a key moment in the expansion of the settler colonial state in Australia. Fueled by the gold rushes, faster and more frequent maritime connections facilitated dramatic population growth from an estimated 405,000 in 1851 to 1.145 million in 1861. It was a period of accelerating information flows driven by faster sailing routes and experiments with steamships and telegraph lines. The colonial economy diversified and grew. I've borrowed one example from Simon Ville's work to try to illustrate this, which is that the number of banks in Australia grew from 8 to 15. The number of bank branches went from 24 to 197. And all these kind of new specialist financiers like land companies, insurance companies, building societies, and so on were all established in this period. Wealth extracted from the gold fields and those who mined on them was transformed into urban infrastructure, new businesses in the manufacturing and service sectors, and especially into a pastoral industry that would grow exponentially for the next 40 years, going from an estimated 19 million kilos of wool exports in 1850 to 210 million by 1890. So that's just one example that the 1850s was clearly this transformative moment. And the prevailing framework for interpreting this moment in Australian history remains this idea of the compression of space. The idea famously articulated by Geoffrey Blainey that Australia was isolated from the world by distance, but by the 1850s, technological and technical innovations were starting to compress that distance and bind Australia more tightly into the sprawling webs of 19th century globalisation. And this compression idea is outdated from all sorts of angles. So one, which is pertinent given the seminar series this paper is a part of, is that the myth of Australia's past isolation is simply untenable. But the compression framework is also out of step with the kind of more theoretically sophisticated conception of globalization that has emerged in global history over the last couple of decades. So Roland Wenzelhumer in particular, he's just another. I've got a lot of pictures of ships and icebergs from the 1850s just for fun, none of which is the Ralph Waller, but that's okay. Um, so Wenzelhumer in particular has argued that we need to get away from thinking about globalization as a process of increased and accelerating connectivity. He points out that what we call globalization is a product of the interplay of processes of connection and disconnection, entanglement and disentanglement, integration and disintegration, mobility and friction, linkages and the corrosion of networks, and so on. And to illustrate this argument, Wenzelhumer uses the telegraph as an example to show how this kind of flagship technological innovation didn't actually shrink the world, it, to use his term, warped it. So as Wenzelhumer argues in this quote, telegraph lines certainly contracted the communicative distance between some places, but others remained unchanged and were therefore pushed to the communicative margins. People became accustomed to the convenience of telegraphy, but then had to deal with constant disruptions. So that rather than dissolving space, it became another part of this interplay of disconnectivity. And the case of the Ralph Waller, I think, adds to this way of thinking about space and distance. This violent, momentary collision forces us to acknowledge that the new forms of global connectivity that linked Australia and the world in the 1850s were constantly interacting with the material world. Some ships embraced the risk of plunging into the ice zone to shave 30 or 40 days off the voyage, turbocharging kind of those processes of settler colonial development. But this new form of connectivity expanded the gulf between those ships taking the new route and those sticking to the Admiralty route. Antarctic ice could also slow those new rapid connections, trapping vessels in ice fields for a week or more. Um, and of course, Antarctic ice could sever connections, as in the case of the Guiding Star, or indeed of the Ralph Waller itself, which, after it was repaired in June 1855, left on its second voyage to Peru and disappeared somewhere along the route. Again, quite possibly the leading suspect is an iceberg. And the ripples of these distortions even kind of persisted through time. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, for instance, there's records of at least one steamship captain who would routinely deviate from the conventional steamer route to skirt the shores of the Kerguelen and Crozet Islands, just in case some other vessel had collided with an iceberg, leaving castaways on those islands. So there's this kind of long-term reproduction of those effects. And so I think the case of the Ralph Waller draws attention to Antarctic icebergs as agents of global disconnectivity, warping and distorting the tentative threads of proto-globalization that crossed the ocean around them in ways that had ramifications beyond the ice zone itself. Australia's experience of globalization emerged out of these interactions and from dozens of similar interactions between these planetary and global processes. Which brings me, in the little bit of time I have left, to my second question. We know how the Ralph Waller ended up in that particular spot of the Southern Ocean, but what about the iceberg? So icebergs have kind of become a real kind of cultural symbol in the context of the Anthropocene. Elizabeth Lean has written about this a lot and has put it that kind of the carving of icebergs has become a source of communal guilt, fear, anxiety, and anger. The adoption of satellite monitoring and systematic naming conventions in the 1970s means that individual chunks of ice are now identified and tracked over their lifetimes, from their births in Antarctica to their deaths in the ocean far to the north. And because of this, a handful of icebergs have attained celebrity status, such as this one, iceberg B09B, or more recent ones like A68 that carved from the Larsen Ice Shelf in 2017 and headed towards the island of South Georgia. Some of these icebergs have become subjects of intense media coverage. Their journeys have been tracked in real time by dedicated social media accounts, And scholars such as Lean have experimented with writing biographies that chronicle the lives, travels, and deaths of individual icebergs. Now, the iceberg that collided with the Ralph Waller was not named, tracked, or monitored, but as I've argued, it did attain a kind of global significance of its own. It would be impossible to write a biography of this iceberg, since it does appear in the historical record for about 10 seconds, but I think we can do a little bit of kind of guesswork and connecting things to think about its likely path. So the iceberg that crossed paths with the Ralph Waller would have begun its life when it carved from a glacier or ice shelf somewhere on the coast of Antarctica. A glacier is defined as a body of dense ice formed by compressed snow that is constantly moving downhill under its own weight. An ice shelf is a floating platform of glacial ice that is fed by one or more glaciers. Glacial ice is defined by its constant state of movement. Gravity acts on the glacier's immense mass, forcing it downhill. As the glacier flows over uneven surfaces, gravity causes tensions in the ice, creating crevices, and when the glacier reaches the sea, it is further weakened by the corrosive effects of the water and by the tension between gravity and the glacier's buoyancy. Eventually, gravity overcomes the structural integrity of the ice, and large sections of the glacier or ice shelf break off or carve, creating icebergs. Two forces then combine to gently push these icebergs westwards from their point of origin. The Coriolis force, caused by the Earth's rotation, deflects icebergs to the left, while the Antarctic coastal current is westward flowing, which means that young icebergs tend to drift slowly westwards, often becoming snagged on the sea floor or on frozen sea ice for years at a time. And so that's the case with B09b, where you can see here it got caught on the Mertz Glacier, which ended up snapping off the tongue of the glacier, producing a new iceberg. And so that kind of slowed it down for several years. The westward drifts of these icebergs then interacts with the bathymetry of the seabed. So for example, the Kerguelen Plateau, which is the submerged volcanic plateau in the southern Indian Ocean between Australia and Madagascar, has a steep drop in the seabed that deflects the current northwards, which guides icebergs north into the warmer, eastward flowing Antarctic circumpolar current. So you can kind of see that line here, where the westward flowing icebergs are deflected by the seabed north into the circumpolar current that flows eastwards. These icebergs then start to break up faster in the warmer conditions of the circumpolar current. They're further deflected northwards by the Coriolis force and eastward by the circumpolar current and the westerly winds. And this results in these small clusters of disintegrating icebergs drifting on a northeasterly trajectory into relatively low latitudes until they melt completely. And that's this little patch of red. This is just a data set of 10 years, but it gives a good insight of how it ended up where the Ralph Waller was. The iceberg that encountered the Ralph Waller in 1855 was an outlier. Very few icebergs have been recorded in that particular part of the Southern Ocean, and never in March. So it's the only one on record for that month. Given the sheer number of iceberg encounters that year, it's likely that there was an enormous calving event some point in the preceding decade, most likely at a medium-sized East Antarctic ice shelf, such as the Amery ice shelf or maybe the Shackleton ice shelf. Both of them have calving cycles of 60 to 70 years. They had observed events in the early 1960s, which fits with a large calving event in the 1840s, and then a kind of 10 to 15 year journey north. So this large iceberg, which based on the 1963 carving of the Amery ice shelf would be about 10,000 square kilometers, would have then drifted westwards in the Antarctic coastal current. It was likely stranded at various points along the way before being deflected by the Kerguelen Plateau and then breaking up in the circumpolar current. One of these smaller icebergs then continued to drift on a northeasterly course until it collided with the Ralph Waller, was split in two, and likely disintegrated within days. The final point I want to make in this paper is that this complex process of iceberg drift is entangled in some of the planet's most fundamental environmental processes. So to limit myself to one example, as glacial ice moves, it grinds against rock. As it does so, it incorporates sediment into the ice that is rich in micronutrients, especially iron, and so it brings those nutrients into the ice. Um, the Southern Ocean is abundant in the macronutrients that are needed for phytoplankton to flourish: nitrate, phosphate, and silicic acid. But the growth of phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean is constrained by the lack of availability of micronutrients, especially iron and manganese. As these icebergs drift and then melt, they fertilize the surrounding water with the micronutrients that were incorporated into the glacial ice, which creates phytoplankton blooms. The drift of icebergs through the Southern Ocean is effectively a path of fertilized water. Two of the highest concentrations of phytoplankton blooms in the Southern Ocean are at the Scotia Sea over here near South Georgia, known as Iceberg Alley, and on the Kerguelen Plateau, again following the path of the icebergs. And these phytoplankton blooms are essential to global carbon cycling. The phytoplankton absorb mind-blowing amounts of carbon through photosynthesis. Then when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, which brings that carbon down. It creates a kind of biological carbon pump that transfers excess carbon from the atmosphere to the deep ocean, storing it for centuries. And this process, which is kick-started by the biogeochemical cycling function of icebergs, has made the Southern Ocean the world's most important and effective carbon sink, which has played this crucial role in moderating the effects of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 centuries. And that's just one process. Iceberg drift also plays a key role in the water cycle. As icebergs melt, they create cool, low salinity water that lowers the freezing point of seawater, which facilitates the growth of sea ice in winter, which that difference between the growth of sea ice in winter and the melting in summer is what drives the process of thermohaline circulation, which drags warm water towards the poles, pushes cool water towards the tropics, stabilizes climate and weather systems around the world, and transports nutrient-rich water throughout the world ocean, and therefore absorbs so much of the excess heat produced by greenhouse gas emissions. There's much more that could be said on that, on the place of icebergs in Earth systems processes. But these brief examples, at least, I hope, are illustrative of this phenomenon. And so to conclude then, both the Ralph Waller and the iceberg were, at the moment of their brief encounter, into the final stage of journeys that were clearly part of much larger processes. The ship was a single fragile thread in a wave of globalizing processes in the 1850s that were connecting people, cargo, and information over vast geographical distances. But as the Ralph Waller's voyage shows, this was far from a linear process. Australia's accelerating global integration was made up of innumerable individual voyages, each of which negotiated these endless points of friction and disconnection as they moved through the material world. The iceberg was a single outlying component of a vast process of thermohaline circulation. Sorry, it's hard to say all these terms. This is my first attempt at a paper on this as well. But they were a single outlying component of the vast process of thermohaline circulation that shapes the world ocean, global climate, and processes of nutrient and carbon cycling. And so by reconstructing the moment of encounter between ship and iceberg and looking out from that isolated spot in the Southern Ocean, I think we can start to see how the interaction, the collisions between these global and planetary processes have been a force in shaping Australian and world history. So I will finish up there.
Thank you so much, Rowan. That was absolutely fascinating. Fabulous stuff. Thank you. Now, David, can you highlight me and the audience? Thank you so much. Wow, that's amazing. Amazing. The idea of the agency of the iceberg is really fascinating, and I've given a lot of thought to that myself about other, particularly the agency of coral reefs.
Mm.
And the obvious one, of course, is the Endeavour up near 1770 in Agnes Waters when it came up against the Endeavour, and obviously, and again, it was what's interesting there is Fothering was actually
Yeah.
their salvation as well. So there's a rather nice little connection there. So fantastic stuff. Um, I wonder, it was really rich, Rowan. So I'm not really sure. I wonder if you'd just like to give us, please, anybody who's got a question, pop your hand up or make yourself known so that I can tell. But I'm just going to ask a couple of quick things. The first one is definitely, I think we need to get on to Peter Weir and Russell Crowe because there's definitely a movie in this one. I think that's the, sort of a sequel to Master and Commander
I
or
like
something
the way
like
you
that.
think.
I like that idea. I wondered if you just take us through a little bit more detail on the exceptional normal as you're using it in this particular, because it's brilliant stuff. So it deserves a little more.
Yeah. That's on the spot a bit, isn't it? So my take on the idea of the exceptional normal is engaging seriously with outliers rather than norms. And that term kind of emerges in a very particular kind of historiographical context, I guess, that it's a reaction to a very kind of social scientific model of history of looking at averages and normals
Mm.
to kind of construct the average ordinary historical experience. And it comes from the idea that actually by looking at the cases that don't quite fit, that are unusual in some way, um, often mean that they're better documented and kind of create these sort of entry points that then make visible those much larger social structures and cultural structures of the world around them. And so they may be exceptional, but they allow you to interpret and understand the
Yeah.
normal in a far deeper way that would not be possible at any other kind of scale.
Uh, I, I I agree, and I'd love to take this up and have
Yeah.
a conversation with you, but I am aware I do not wish to dominate. I believe Mark Harris put his hand up and would, no, didn't? He was just swatting away a mosquito. Okay. Does anybody have any comments or questions for Rowan? I can keep going because I I love this stuff. Nope, no one's putting their hand up. Okay. Uh, I'm wondering, you tying it into the trade, particularly the wool trade, and yeah, these outliers, as we were just mentioning then,
Mm.
this exceptional normal. It is completely fascinating, and here's a completely, this is truly out of left field. A few years ago, I was doing something in Canada, and I was talking to somebody who had been studying Navajo wool. The Navajo Nation,
Mm.
very big sheep, make sheep, grow sheep, herd sheep, and then they weave the wool into particular things. And she was telling me that what became clear from after the 1850s was where the Navajo people used to weave a rug, which was often used as a carpet on a floor, they shifted to weaving what we now call Navajo blankets because they were importing Australian wool, which is of a was considered to be of a
Mm.
superior and finer quality, and therefore they shifted from making these carpets into making what became blankets. Now, to me, that is so far away from what we might imagine Australian wool, the wool on the sheep's back and all of the rest. And yet, here's something that's happening truly in an exceptionally small community. I mean, the Navajo Nation, while we might think of it as a large community of people, it is still really ultimately a relatively small community of people. But there's a fundamental change to what happens within that community and then by extension within their trading networks on the basis of wool that was grown in Australia, which had come from Europe. The sheep had come from Europe to Australia, and then, of course, it it just goes, wild because we have so much good food for the sheep. And that strikes me as another example of this kind of tentacles that we can't really even imagine until we start to think of really extraordinary, kind of extraordinary connections.
Yeah,
We do
that's
have a
such a wonderful
question.
example. I
It's
love that.
it's always been in my head. I just find it so astonishing.
I'll have to follow up with you on that one. That's wonderful. Thank you.
I've got two questions. I'll go to Harrison first. He says, "Hello and Happy New Year, Gem team. My question is, could Rowan talk a little bit about the emotionality of the iceberg encounter?" And then I've got a question from Leonie after that.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you for joining it. I have no idea what time.
It must be
Um,
some ungodly time.
it's a really good question, and it's something I'm kind of working on a bit in terms of trying to unpack. In that I don't have a huge amount of material at the moment, and this is where this being a pilot, where I basically said I'm going to look at 1855 as my pilot project, and then do all the other years later, and then got bogged down by one iceberg, my favorite iceberg. And so I haven't gone as deeply into some of the source material as I would like to, but I know it's out there. But in terms of some of the examples from this, you absolutely have kind of there's a level of trauma involved. And I think this feeds into some of that kind of disconnection idea in the way that I've found one example of someone saying they would never get on a ship again because of their traumatic experience amidst ice. I suspect there would be people that sort out that other route to avoid it, or maybe sort out steam travel to avoid it. I don't have any evidence to support that suspicion yet, but I'm hoping to find it. Um, but certainly there's a degree of kind of trauma that comes out of a lot of these encounters. Anxiety through passenger writing at the time is a really key theme, and kind of horror at the same time as a sort of conflicting, whilst the icebergs are far enough away, a kind of sublime angle. And so you end up with people who sit and paint the icebergs. And there's a couple of things that, because I knew this was being recorded, I didn't want to put anything I wasn't sure on the rights of into the slides, but there's a really good example of kind of paintings that passengers did on the deck of ships of icebergs because of the kind of aesthetic appreciation for them. So there's a kind of positive association as well. And I think, again, it has these ripple effects. That example I mentioned of the woman who wrote to the Argus because her entire family was overdue on a ship that had probably hit an iceberg and sunk, shows that there's kind of this emotional world of concern around the safety of shipping. And that becomes much bigger in the 1890s when even more ships kind of go missing in the context of a major calving event. And I want to dive deeper into that particular moment. I think that's when it will become even clearer. But certainly that's the kind of early thoughts on that and still working it out. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Rowan. Leonie's got a question, then I've got a question from Campbell McKnight. Leonie?
Yeah, look, thanks, Rowan. That was so fantastic. I leading on from Harry's question about emotionality, I, I was really struck by this image of all of the male passengers, like everyone pitching in and, in extreme and in very surprising way, managing to limp into port, through this heroic collective effort. I wondered, was that typical of similar events, that collectivism of, passengers and crew, everyone, sort of stepping in 24 hours a day to man the pumps? Was that typical, or does it tell us something about the leadership of the captain here, or yeah?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't want to go like totally confidently say it wasn't typical, but
Mm.
certainly other iceberg encounters, it's not typical.
Yeah.
So you look at the example of the Guardian, for example, is the really famous one where it's a sort of quiet mutiny that doesn't get discussed in that way at the time because the captain survives and most of the people who fled the ship didn't. But
Mm.
they essentially demanded the right to leave the ship. And it was only those who couldn't fit or chose to stay with Ryu who said, actually, I think I can pilot this ship back to South Africa.
Mm.
Um, and so, and in some cases, there was a complaint by one passenger and his daughter who he said had been prevented from leaving the ship. And he complained about that, even though he survived and most of the people who left didn't. And so that kind of challenge to the captain's authority is definitely a big part of reactions to these kinds of disasters in a lot of sort of maritime disasters. Um, Fire on ships as well is another kind of similar example where there's a lot of panic, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily typical, but there's also a lot of examples where it is similar things do happen. So it's an outlier maybe a little bit, but
Mhm.
I'd say it's not at a crazy extreme in terms of how uncommon a reaction this would be. And it's definitely centrally directed authority. Um, Butter's diary, there's basically three surviving accounts of this from three different people, and Butter's diary is the most detailed one. And he's very clear that a bunch of the crew went and broke into the rum supplies as soon as they hit the iceberg. And the captain basically said, no, all the men get into this now. And it's quite an authoritarian response to the disaster. But yeah, I'll have to think further on it because it's a really interesting question of just how untypical and what that tells us.
Rowan, we've got two more
Sorry.
questions. Campbell McKnight's question is, how do whalers and whaling voyages fit into this? So if you
Yep.
want to take that one, and then there's one last one from Ian McNiven. So,
Yeah. So in terms of whalers and whaling voyages, I'm kind of self-consciously avoiding them in my account as much as possible because it is the established one of that's who was in these seas and they expect to see icebergs and it's kind of a common part of that experience. And even kind of talking to experts in ice stuff, the reconstructed historical data sets of Antarctic icebergs are mainly based on whaling voyages because people haven't thought to look
mm.
in the passenger ones so much that the icebergs were kind of further north than people expected, and the ships went further south, and so the overlap is a little bit bigger. Um, but absolutely, whalers and whaling voyagers were even more intimately involved in this way. And there's some really good stuff. There's a John Gascoigne article about kind of globalisation
Mm.
and American whalers.
Yeah.
There's some really good kind of scholarship emerging on that I'm aware of, but not kind of in this particular project grappling with because I think it's a little bit more accepted. And Ian McNiven's question, I'm wondering to what extent mariners engaged with the numerous and sentient dimensions of the sea and thought about religious aspects of the iceberg encounter and prayed to help ensure iceberg avoidance. That is such a great question and is going to have to be one of those things I need to look into more. My kind of immediate answer is yes, they mention it everywhere. It's every single account is infused with religious imagery and talking about prayer. But it's not something I've really thought about. So I'm going to make a note of that. Thank you.
I'll also put in a plug for Ian McNiven's new book called Sentient Seas. Has just been published, or it's actually just been printed. I'm not sure it's even actually formally launched, but it's University of Florida Press, I believe. So that will be one to look out for as well.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take that up to the end. We've got 2 minutes, and I can just tell you about some upcoming events. David will put up the final slide. Thank you so much, Rowan. Greatly appreciate
Thank you.
this wonderful talk you've given us. Now, what we have coming up in a little less than 2 weeks, are we having an extra special seminar. It's going to be on a Tuesday, the 3rd of March. Again, it'll be online. And Professor Anya Schwartz, a colleague of ours from the University of Potsdam, will be in Melbourne. And she's going to be talking on Tupaia's map of Oceania. Those of you who know Tupaia's map is one of the most enigmatic, famous maps actually created out of the encounter by from Polynesian and European encounters. And he ended up on Cook's voyage. So it's a really important, tremendously important event. And she's come at it from a slightly different angle, having found some recently, I guess, new material in archival material. And she's not only demonstrates that the map itself is highly sophisticated demonstration of Polynesian navigation skills, but also that it represents a remarkable feat of translation from wayfind traditional indigenous wayfinding systems into European mapping. Following that, on in exactly a month's time, on the Thursday the 19th, Dr. Natalie Pearson from the University of Sydney is going to be talking about maritime encounters, the Belatung shipwreck and its many afterlives. I think that's going to be absolutely fabulous and so interesting. Anyone who's passed through Singapore in the last couple of years and has had the chance to see the Belatung shipwreck and exhibition at the Asian Civilizations Museum is absolutely extraordinary. Anyone who's over in WA, from the 6th of February to the 29th of March, our Awakening Histories exhibition, that's the Global Encounters exhibition that came out of our project, will be on until the 29th of March. I hope some people get to see it. And finally, it's not going to be particularly helpful to you all, but we will be doing a panel discussion at the Makassar International Writers Festival in South Sulawesi in Makassar in May. So thank you everybody for joining us. I hope I see lots of you next time at Anya's talk, and then again later in March for Natalie Pearson's talk. Rohan, thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate it. Absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so
good
much,
night,
Rohan.
everybody. Night, everyone.